Jake Morrison crawled through the narrow maintenance tunnel, his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The metal walls pressed close on both sides, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Most people would feel trapped in here, but Jake found peace in these forgotten spaces. Nobody bothered him here. Nobody looked down on him or whispered about his past. The UE's horizon hummed around him, its massive engines pushing the ship deeper into space than any human had gone before. 57 people lived and worked on this vessel, but Jake might as well have been invisible. He fixed their problems, kept their systems running, and stayed out of their way. That was how everyone liked it. His radio crackled to life. "Morrison, we need you in Section 12. The air recycler is making noise again." Jake sighed and checked his watch. Another 14 hours left in his shift. "On my way," he said into the radio. He crawled backward through the tunnel until he reached a junction, then dropped down into the main corridor. The lights here were bright and clean, nothing like the dim workspaces he spent most of his time in. A group of officers walked past, their voices excited as they talked about the mission. "The Valdorians are supposed to be amazing," one of them said. "Captain Turner thinks they might share their technology with us. Can you imagine? We could have ships that travel twice as fast, maybe even 3 times. Another replied. Jake kept his head down and walked in the opposite direction. He had heard the same excited talk for weeks now. The Valdorians were some kind of advanced alien race that had agreed to meet with humans. Everyone on the ship acted like they were about to become famous just for being here. Section 12 was in the lower levels, where the real work happened. Jake found the malfunctioning air recycler and opened its control panel. The problem was simple enough: a loose connection that had been vibrating against the housing. He tightened it and ran a quick test. The noise stopped. "Fixed," he reported over the radio. "Good. Now get to the shuttle bay. We need someone to check the loading equipment before the captain takes her team down to the planet." Jake made his way to the shuttle bay, passing more groups of excited crew members. Through the large windows, he could see their destination growing larger ahead of them. The Valdorian homeworld looked beautiful from space, with blue oceans and white clouds swirling around green continents. The shuttle bay buzzed with activity. Captain Lisa Turner stood near the main shuttle, talking with her senior officers. She was a good captain, fair and smart, but she had never spoken directly to Jake in the 3 months since they left Earth. To her, he was just another piece of equipment that kept the ship running. "The Valdorians have invited 30 of us to their capital city," Captain Turner was saying. "This is the most important mission in human history. We need to make a good impression." Jake started checking the loading equipment, running diagnostics on the mechanical arms that would load supplies into the shuttle. Everything looked normal, but he noticed something odd on one of the monitors. The external cameras showed several Valdorian ships in the distance, much closer than they had been an hour ago. He walked over to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the chief medical officer. She was one of the few people who had ever been polite to him. "Dr. Hayes," he said quietly, "are those ships supposed to be that close?" She looked at the monitor he was pointing to. "I don't know. You should ask the captain." Jake looked over at Captain Turner, who was still talking with her officers. He had never interrupted her before, and he wasn't sure she would even listen to him. After a moment, he decided to try anyway. "Captain," he said, walking over to the group. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at him with surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started talking. "What is it, Morrison?" Captain Turner asked. "Those Valdorian ships, ma'am. They're a lot closer than they were before. I thought you should know." Captain Turner glanced at the monitor, then back at Jake. "They're probably just curious about our ship. The Valdorians are peaceful people, Morrison. That's why we're here." "Yes, ma'am. It's just that's all, Morrison. Get back to work." Jake felt his face get hot, but he nodded and walked away. The other officers had already gone back to their conversation. As if he had never been there at all. He finished checking the loading equipment and was about to leave when he heard Captain Turner announce the departure. "All right, people, let's make history." The 30 selected crew members boarded the shuttle, their faces bright with excitement. Jake watched from the observation deck as the shuttle left the horizon and headed toward the planet below. Within minutes, it was just a small dot against the blue sky. The remaining crew members returned to their duties, but Jake stayed at the observation deck for a while longer. Something about the Valdorian ships bothered him, though he couldn't say exactly what. They moved in perfect formation, never varying their distance from each other. Most ships would drift slightly, their pilots making small corrections. But these ships stayed locked in position, like they were connected by invisible wires. Jake had learned to trust his instincts during his time in the military. Before his discharge, he had been a combat engineer, trained to spot things that didn't belong. The way the Valdorian ships moved reminded him of predators circling their prey. He shook his head and walked away from the observation deck. Maybe Captain Turner was right. Maybe he was just being paranoid. The Valdorians had reached out to humanity with offers of friendship and technology sharing. They were supposed to be one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, but as Jake made his way back to the maintenance sections, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ship felt different somehow, like the moment before a storm when the air gets heavy and still. He decided to keep an eye on those external cameras. If the Valdorian ships moved any closer, he would try to warn someone again. Even if they didn't listen to him, he had to try. Jake Morrison had been ignored his whole life, but he had never stopped watching. And right now, he was the only one watching the watchers. 3 days passed without any word from the shuttle team. Jake watched the communication screens in the maintenance areas, hoping to hear Captain Turner's voice reporting their success. But the radio stayed quiet, the remaining crew on the horizon grew worried. Dr. Patricia Hayes called meetings every few hours, trying to figure out what to do. Security Chief Carlos Mendez prepared rescue shuttles and checked weapons that had never been fired outside of training. Jake spent those 3 days watching the Valdorian ships through the external cameras. More ships had joined the original group. They now formed a perfect circle around the horizon, staying exactly the same distance away. Jake counted 15 ships, all moving in that same strange, connected way. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake found Dr. Hayes in the medical bay. She was packing medical supplies into emergency kits, her hands shaking slightly. "Doctor," Jake said, "I think we're in trouble." She looked up at him with tired eyes. "What do you mean?" "Those ships out there. They're not just watching us anymore. They're surrounding us. And I've been checking the shuttle's tracking signal. It stopped moving 3 days ago, right after it landed." Dr. Hayes set down the medical kit she was holding. "Are you saying something happened to them?" "I'm saying we need to get out of here, right now." Before Dr. Hayes could respond, Security Chief Mendez's voice came over the ship's communication. "System, all crew to stations, we have incoming vessels." Jake ran to the nearest observation window. The Valdorian ships were moving closer, breaking their perfect circle formation, but something was wrong with how they moved. They seemed to flow through space like liquid, bending and shifting in ways that ships shouldn't be able to move. Jake grabbed his tool bag and headed for the bridge. Maybe now someone would listen to him. But when he arrived, Chief Mendez blocked his way. "Not now, Morrison. We have a situation here. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I've been watching those ships for 3 days. Something's not right about them. Get back to your station. We need all systems running." Jake felt anger rise in his chest. "Listen to me. Those ships aren't normal. The way they move, the way they stay in formation. And the shuttle team hasn't reported in because something happened to them." Mendez stepped closer to Jake, his hand moving to his weapon. Are you trying to cause panic? Because that's the last thing we need right now. I'm trying to save our lives. You're trying to get attention, just like always. Mendez turned to two other crew members. Escort Morrison to his quarters. Keep him there until this is over. Jake started to protest, but the two crew members took his arms and led him away from the bridge. They walked him to his small room in the lower levels and locked the door behind him. Jake sat on his narrow bed and put his head in his hands. Through his small window, he could see the Valdorian ships getting closer. They looked beautiful in the starlight, their hulls shining like polished metal. But Jake had learned not to trust beautiful things that moved like predators. An hour later, the first Valdorian ship reached the horizon. Jake pressed his face to the window and watched as the alien vessel came alongside their hull. He expected to see docking procedures, maybe some kind of communication between the ships. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The Valdorian ship simply passed through the horizon's hull as if it wasn't there. Dark shapes flowed from one ship to the other like smoke, but smoke that moved with purpose. Jake pounded on his door. "Let me out. They're boarding the ship." Number 1 answered. Jake could hear alarms starting to sound throughout the horizon. Then he heard something worse, screaming. The screams came from the upper levels first, then spread downward through the ship. Jake could hear people running in the corridors outside his room, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Someone fired a weapon, then fired again and again. The shooting stopped suddenly. Jake looked around his small room for anything he could use to break down the door. His tool bag was still with him. Mendez's people hadn't thought to take it away. He pulled out a plasma cutter and began working on the door's lock mechanism. The screaming was getting closer now. Jake could hear Dr. Hayes shouting orders to someone, telling them to seal the medical bay. Her voice was cut off in the middle of a sentence. The door lock finally gave way. Jake opened the door carefully and looked out into the corridor. The lights were flickering, and the air smelled wrong, like something burning, mixed with something sweet and sick. Jake moved quietly down the corridor toward the emergency stairs. He needed to get to the main computer systems. If he could send a warning signal back to Earth, maybe other ships wouldn't fall into the same trap. As he climbed the stairs, he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was like voices singing, but the melody was all wrong. The notes hurt his ears and made his teeth ache. Mixed in with the singing, he could hear human voices crying for help. Jake reached the computer center and found the door standing open. Inside, he could see technician Gary Brooks slumped over his console. Jake called his name softly, but Gary didn't move. When Jake got closer, he saw that Gary's eyes were open, but completely empty, like someone had turned off a light inside. His head. Jake sat down at another console and began typing commands. He needed to access the communication array and send a message to Earth Command. But when he tried to connect to the ship's main systems, he found that something else was already there. The computer screens filled with symbols that hurt to look at. The symbols moved and shifted, forming patterns that seemed to reach out from the screen toward Jake's face. He forced himself to look away and tried a different approach. Behind him, the singing was getting louder. Jake could hear footsteps in the corridor, but they didn't sound like human footsteps. They sounded like something trying to walk like a human, but not quite getting it right. Jake's fingers flew over the keyboard, trying every access code he knew. Finally, he managed to connect to the emergency communication system. He began typing a message to Earth Command, warning them about the Valdorians and telling them not to trust any peaceful contact offers. The singing stopped suddenly. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Jake finished typing his message and hit the send command just as something dark flowed into the room behind him. He turned around and saw his worst fears confirmed. The Valdorians weren't the elegant, peaceful beings they had pretended to be. They were shadows with too many teeth, darkness that moved with hungry purpose. Jake Morrison, the man no one watched, was now the only one left to watch. Jake stared at the dark shape in the doorway. It looked like smoke at first, but then it began to take form. Arms and legs appeared, then a head with eyes that glowed like dying stars. The thing that had pretended to be a beautiful Veldorian now showed its true face. The creature moved toward Jake, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Jake grabbed his plasma cutter and fired it at the thing. The beam passed right through it, like it was made of air. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your weapons cannot hurt us, little human. We are beyond your understanding." Jake backed toward the emergency exit, keeping the plasma cutter pointed at the creature even though it was useless. "What did you do to my friends? We fed on them. Their hope tasted so sweet when it turned to despair. And now we will feed on you." The creature reached out with one shadowy hand. Jake dodged and ran for the exit. Behind him, he heard the creature flowing after him like water. Jake ran down the corridor, his mind racing. The plasma cutter hadn't worked because the creature could make itself like smoke. But it had to become solid to grab things, to feed on people. That meant there had to be a way to hurt it. He reached a junction in the corridor and turned toward the engineering section. This was his territory, the place where he knew every pipe and wire. If he was going to survive, it would be down here in the forgotten spaces where no one else ever went. Jake reached the main engineering panel and began typing commands. The ship's power systems were still mostly working, which meant he could control them. He started rerouting power from the life support systems to the hull plating. If he could create a strong enough electromagnetic field, maybe he could trap the creatures when they tried to become solid. Something moved in the shadows behind him. Jake spun around and saw 3 of the creatures flowing toward him like living darkness. He hit the emergency power button, and the hull plating around the engineering section became charged with electricity. One of the creatures reached for him and suddenly screamed as its hand became solid and touched the charged wall. The electromagnetic field had forced it to take physical form, and now the electricity was hurting it. Jake smiled grimly. Now we're getting somewhere. He ran to another control panel and began setting up more traps. He flooded Section 7 with toxic gases from the waste processing system. He overloaded the artificial gravity in Section 12, making it so heavy that anything solid would be crushed. He turned the ventilation system into a weapon, creating pressure waves that could knock a person off their feet. The creatures came after him, but now Jake was ready for them. He led them through the ship like a hunter leading prey, triggering trap after trap. When they tried to phase through walls, he electrified the walls. When they tried to solidify to grab him, he crushed them with gravity or poisoned them with gas. After an hour of running and fighting, Jake found himself in the lower storage area. His clothes were torn, and he had cuts on his arms from crawling through damaged sections. But he was alive, and behind him lay the remains of 6 creatures that had thought humans were easy prey. Jake heard voices calling from a sealed section nearby. He followed the sound and found Dr. Hayes and 4 other crew members locked inside a storage room. "Jake," Dr. Hayes called out when she saw him. "Thank God you're alive. We've been hiding here since the attack started." Jake used his plasma cutter to open the sealed door. The survivors came out, their faces pale with fear. "How many of those things are there?" asked Engineer Amy Rodriguez. "I don't know," Jake said. "But I know how to kill them now. The electromagnetic fields force them to become solid. Once they're solid, we can hurt them with electricity, pressure, anything physical." "How do you know all this?" asked Navigator Ben Clark. Jake looked at the group of survivors. These were people who had ignored him for months, who had treated him like he was invisible. Now they were looking at him like he might be their only hope. "I used to be a combat engineer," Jake said. "Before I came here, I fought in the Martian tunnel wars, We learned to use whatever we had as weapons because we never had enough real weapons. Dr. Hayes stared at him. You were a combat engineer? But your file says you were discharged for doing what I had to do to keep my people alive, Jake finished. My commanders didn't like my methods. They said I was too brutal, too willing to break rules. But my unit had the lowest casualty rate in the whole war. Jake looked around at the damaged ship, at the frightened faces of the survivors. These creatures have been hunting other species for thousands of years. They're used to prey that runs away or surrenders. They don't know how to fight something that fights back. He began explaining his trap system to the others, showing them how to use the ship's own systems as weapons. Dr. Hayes learned to control the medical bay's sterilization systems, turning them into poison gas dispensers. Amy Rodriguez figured out how to overload power conduits to create electric barriers. Ben Clark used his knowledge of the ship's layout to predict where the creatures would go next. Together, they began hunting the hunters. Jake led them through the ship, setting up ambushes and traps. The creatures that had terrorized 100 worlds found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. Humans who refused to give up. The turning point came when they reached the shuttle bay. Jake realized that more creatures were still coming through the Valdorian ships outside. He had to stop them at the source. I'm going to ram the horizon into their capital city, Jake told the others. It's the only way to make them stop. That's suicide, Dr. Hayes said. Maybe, but it's better than letting them kill everyone else. Jake began programming the ship's navigation system for a collision course with the planet below. But before he could complete the sequence, a voice came over the communication system. Wait, human, we wish to negotiate. Jake looked up at the speakers. Now you want to talk? You have proven to be more dangerous than we anticipated. Perhaps we can reach an agreement. Jake's finger hovered over the final command button. Around him, the survivors waited to see what he would do. You're right, Jake said. Let's negotiate. But we're going to do it my way. Jake kept his finger on the collision course button as he spoke into the communication system. I'm listening, but you better talk fast. The voice that came back sounded different now. Less confident, more worried. We underestimated your species. This was not supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen? Jake asked. You were supposed to feed on us like all the others? Yes, for 10,000 years we have been the hunters of this galaxy. When species reach the stars, we welcome them with friendship. Then we feed on their hope and despair. It has always worked. Dr. Hayes stepped closer to the communication panel. How many species have you destroyed? Hundreds. Maybe thousands. We stopped counting long ago. But humans are different. You fight in ways we have never seen. Jake looked around at the damaged shuttle bay, at the bodies of the creatures he had killed with nothing but ship systems and determination. We're not special, we just don't give up. That is what makes you dangerous, the voice said. We offer you a trade. We will return your people and leave your species alone. In exchange, you will not tell other species about us. Jake laughed. But there was no humor in it. You think I'm stupid? You'll just wait a few years and try again when we're not ready. We swear by the old laws. I don't care about your laws, Jake interrupted. Here's my offer. You return every human you took, alive and healthy. You also return every other person from every other species you've captured, all of them. Silence came from the speakers. Finally, the voice returned. That is impossible. Some have been with us for centuries. They are part of us now. Then you better figure out how to separate them, because that's the only deal you're getting. Jake began entering commands into the navigation system again. The ship started turning toward the planet below. Wait, the voice said. We cannot. Release them all. It would destroy us. Good, Jake said. Maybe the galaxy will be a safer place. The communication went quiet for several minutes. Jake could see the Valdorian ships outside moving in agitated patterns. They were talking to each other, probably trying to figure out what to do. Amy Rodriguez was monitoring the ship's sensors. "Jake, I'm picking up movement on the planet's surface." "Lots of it." Jake looked at her readings. Energy signatures were appearing all over the Valdorian capital city. "Something big was happening down there." The voice came back over the speakers, sounding defeated. "We will do as you ask. But you must understand, this will change everything. For 10,000 years, we have kept the weak species from spreading across the galaxy. Without us, chaos will come." "Maybe," Jake said. "But at least they'll have a chance to fight back." Over the next hour, Jake watched as shuttles began leaving the planet's surface. The first shuttle that docked with the Horizon carried Captain Turner and the rest of the original away team. They looked weak and pale, but they were alive. Captain Turner stumbled onto the bridge, supported by two of her officers. When she saw Jake standing at the command station, she stared at him in confusion. "Morrison, what are you doing here?" "Where is everyone else?" Dr. Hayes stepped forward. "Jake saved us, Captain. The Valdorians weren't what they seemed. They were hunters, and Jake figured out how to fight them." More shuttles arrived, carrying not just humans, but dozens of other species. There were tall, thin beings with blue skin and large eyes. Small, furry creatures that looked almost like Earth animals. Rock-like beings that moved slowly, but spoke with deep, rumbling voices. Jake realized he was looking at the survivors of hundreds of worlds, species that everyone thought were extinct. The Valdorians had been keeping them as a private food source. For thousands of years. As the rescued prisoners filled the Horizon's corridors, Jake walked to the observation deck. Through the windows, he could see the Valdorian ships pulling away from the planet. Some of them looked damaged, as if releasing. Their prisoners had physically hurt them. Captain Turner found him there an hour later. She walked up to him slowly, like she was seeing him for the first time. "Morrison, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." Jake looked at her, but didn't say anything. "Earth Command is sending a fleet," she continued. "They got your warning. Message, they want to promote you, give you your own ship. You could be an admiral if you want." Jake shook his head. "I don't want to be an admiral." "Then what do you want?" Jake thought about it for a moment. "I want to go back to work. The ship needs repairs, and someone has to fix the systems." Captain Turner stared at him. "You just saved the galaxy, Morrison. You can have anything you want." "I want to be left alone to do my job," Jake said. "That's all I ever wanted." 3 months later, Jake was back in the maintenance tunnels of the Horizon. The ship had been repaired and was heading home to Earth. Most of the rescued prisoners had been taken to other ships or stations where they could be cared for properly. Jake was fixing a ventilation fan when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He ignored them at first, but then someone knocked on the access panel. "Mr. Morrison?" a young voice called. "Are you in there?" Jake opened the panel and looked out. A junior officer he didn't recognize was standing in the corridor, looking nervous. "What do you need?" Jake asked. "I'm Ensign Kelly Brown, sir. I just joined the crew. I was wondering if you could teach me some of your fighting techniques, just in case we run into something like the Valdorians again." Jake looked at the young woman. She couldn't be more than 20, fresh out of the academy. But her eyes were serious, and she wasn't looking at him like he was invisible. "It's not really fighting," Jake said. "It's about using what you have and never giving up. That's what I want to learn, sir." Jake thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Meet me in Cargo Bay 3 after your shift. And don't call me sir. I work for a living." As Ensign Brown walked away, Jake went back to fixing the ventilation fan, but he was smiling now. The word was spreading through the fleet. Young officers were asking their captains about the Morrison protocols. Engineers were studying his trap designs. The galaxy was learning that humans were not easy prey. Jake Morrison was still the man no one watched. But now when danger came, Everyone knew where to find him. And that made all the difference. The galaxy had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, other predators were learning that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. In the maintenance tunnels of the horizon, Jake Morrison continued his work. Invisible and ignored, just the way he liked it. But ready, always ready, for the next time someone made the mistake of thinking humans were weak.